Dr. Elena Bennett received her BA from Oberlin College in Ohio, and her MS and her PhD from University of Wisconsin, her PhD in limnology and marine sciences. She's the co-chair of the International Project on Eco-Services, aiming to set the research agenda for ecosystem services for the coming decade, and is the lead author on the IPBES, the Global Assessment. She is a professor at McGill University. She's been a Leopold Leadership Fellow, a Trottier Public Policy Professor. She came to Wolf Ridge many years ago and was in our graduate student naturalist training program, and in that capacity taught about 2,300 students approximately while here at Wolf Ridge. She was a joy to work with, a passionate, dedicated educator that changed the lives of thousands of children. And I'm proud to bring her back here today.
Thanks, Mud. That's so sweet. I was just thinking as you were talking about how many students that I taught when I was at Wolf Ridge and changing their lives. And it's funny because my conception of being at Wolf Ridge, it has all of those students and all of those teachers there, but the way I remember it is how much Wolf Ridge changed my life. It is such an honor to be able to be doing this. I appreciate, Smud, that you didn't say how long ago I was at Wolf Ridge, because it was a long time and it makes me feel old to think about that. But it was a really, really meaningful time in my life. And so it's just delightful to be invited back to kick off this series of talks. So what I want to invite you to do is to just relax for a moment. You can stare at the screen, you can close your eyes, you can just have a moment to think. And I'm going to ask you to think about a particular thing. In particular, I'd like you to picture the environment that you expect on Earth about 50 years from now. So that would be the year 2070. I want you to think about what you see when you look around, what you smell, maybe what you hear. And what I'm curious about is whether you see something like the image you have in front of you, lush green fields, dark fragrant woods, they're filled with bird song, maybe a beautiful lake, maybe Lake Superior. Maybe the air is filled with kids laughing as they're skipping stones across the surface of Lake Superior. Or maybe, if you're following the news these days, you are picturing a giant patch of plastic garbage in the Pacific Ocean, or bleached out coral reefs, or a forest that's lost all of its biodiversity, or even just suburban sprawl, as far as you can see. And I get that. I think when we think about the environment these days and the future of the planet, it is plenty disheartening. We are bombarded with images like this one of dystopian visions of collapse and degradation, and by news about how bad things are and how much worse they're going to get. And I don't want to downplay that, even though I'm going to turn us pretty quickly in another direction. It is important to be aware of some of the problems that we're causing by not living lightly enough on the planet. But what I do want to point out is that when we just extrapolate the current bad trends, we run the risk of setting ourselves up for a self-fulfilling bad future. So we know, for example, that people choose their actions based on what they believe about society and what they expect for the future. So I think of it like steering a car or steering a bike. If you turn your head to look at something, you're going to steer towards that thing. So if the only images we have in front of us are images like this one, then we're likely to steer towards that negative future, even if we know that it's the future that we don't want. So I want to steer away from that and convey to you tonight my vision of the future, which is that it doesn't have to be bleak. And I want to talk a little bit about the role of places like Wolf Ridge in making it suitably not bleak or suitably good. So scientists use this term Anthropocene or Anthropocene to mean the era dominated by people. It's not an official epoch like the Holocene or the Pleistocene, but it's a term that we use to just indicate the level of impact that people are having on the planet. It was popularized by Paul Crutzen, who was a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, and it's picked up steam since he first introduced the term in about the year 2000. So maybe before I get into the Holocene, I'll take a step back. This is the only graph I'm going to show, but it's an important one, and I just want to step back and talk a little bit about the Holocene so that we can think about why the Anthropocene is so different. So let me walk you through this. So this axis here, and it's telling us this is delta 18 oxygen. And what you need to know is that that's a way that scientists measure what we think the climate was like millions or thousands of years ago. We do that by looking at bubbles that are trapped in ice cores. So at the very far end, we're looking at 100,000 years ago and walking our way over towards today. And what you should notice is that climate here just bounces around up and down and up and down, and the downs cause things to happen. So this down causes people to migrate out of Africa, and we get other migrations and other changes in climate. And then we get this. That's the last 11,000 years with almost no bouncing around whatsoever. That is the epoch that we call the Holocene. And it is remarkably stable. It's unlike anything else that we've ever seen before on the planet. It is incredibly stable, and everything that you know about human civilization happens during that time. So that's the Greek civilization, that's the Romans, that's the Renaissance, that's everything happens during that period of stability that we have there. Truly a special time. And so now we find ourselves walking out of that Holocene into a completely different epoch, an epoch of human impact. And that might be human impact like I'm showing here on these slides, where people, even going back to the Native Americans that lived in southern parts of Minnesota, would have been periodically burning grasslands to keep them in prairie in order to keep species around that they wanted to hunt or otherwise collect. Or it can mean other sorts of human impacts, the kinds that we see around us now, building cities, causing flooding through climate change, the plastic that I talked about before, or just denuding. And many of the things that we're doing on the planet are indeed bad news. But what I want to focus on tonight is, does it have to be that way? Does it have to be terrible, or can we have that fabulous Anthropocene? And to me, that is all about the question of, in what direction lies hope? And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a new project that I've been working on these days to sort of bring together some of my work on ecosystem services with this question of hope and where hope is. And so what we see when we look around is that actually, as people notice problems, as they look around and see that we're harvesting too much timber, that we're covering beaches in plastic, that we're building too many cities, as people notice those problems, they start taking action, doing things to make their worlds better. Engaging with the Living Building Challenge is a great example of that. And so it occurred to me that if I wanted to think about how to bring about a better Anthropocene, a better future for the planet, that maybe I needed to look at the things that people were already doing to make the world around them better and treat those as if they were the future, as if the future was already here, just unevenly distributed, as William Gibson likes to say. What happens if those things, if the Living Building Challenge becomes not a thing that just Wolfridge is doing, but a thing that everybody's doing? So let me give you an example. I think actually Wolfridge is a great example of a seed, or a bright spot, but let me give you another example. This is a project called Health in Harmony, and they're actually working in Indonesian Borneo. And it was started by a doctor who got very worried about this part of the world and worried about the orangutans that were going extinct there. And she figured out a way basically to get her doctor friends to help her offer free or low-cost healthcare to communities that committed to stopping deforestation. And the reason she did that was in talking to people and in doing what she calls radical listening, she realized that people weren't cutting down the forest out of greed. They were cutting down the forest because their mom needed medical treatment or their child needed school books, and that people really were lacking access to medical care. And she could provide that in exchange for them saving the forest. And they have had remarkable success. So they have seen now a decrease in illegal logging of about 90% and an increase in every aspect of human health that they measure, including reduction in infant mortality rates. So that's an example of the kind of thing I mean when I say a bright spot. And we also call them seeds because they're sort of like seeds of this better future that are growing. And we've collected about 500 of those from all around the world. And so we're just seeing a few of the dots, and the locations aren't important. So you might notice, for example, that there's none in Australia. And that doesn't actually mean that there's no bright spots in Australia. It just means that me and my scientific colleagues haven't gotten there to ask people yet. So we have a lot more in the areas that we're working. And so you can see, for example, that I'm based in Montreal, and that my other closest colleagues on this project are based in Sweden and in South Africa and in India. And so we have a lot more around the areas that we live, but it's a good sign that these exist all over the place. And we're using these to do a bunch of different things. So we're using these to understand what people want in a better world, in a better Anthropocene. We're using them to understand what pathways we can use to get from where we are now to a better Anthropocene. And we're using them to understand how to make these projects more successful. Why do some grow and thrive and even spread, and others don't? So we can use these scientifically in all sorts of different ways. One of the ways that I'm most excited about is about storytelling, because I was telling you earlier that we steer in the direction that we're looking. And part of that is because stories are just incredibly powerful in pointing our heads different directions. They actually even create our reality as much as they help us to explain it. So it's really important that we have stories, or as we call them in the science world, we call them scenarios, and we build sets of them to go together. But it's really important that we have these stories that help us point in the direction we want to go and help us think about what are the steps we need to take to get from where we are now to where it is we want to go. And so let me talk a little bit about some of the things that we're learning by looking at these seeds or at these bright spots. So one of the things that we notice right away is what people want in their better future. And people want a couple of things in particular. The things that come up over and over and over again are people want to reconnect to community, they want to reconnect to nature, and they want to reconnect to themselves, actually. And those things come up over and over again, and they're very interlinked. So sometimes someone will say to me, well, I started this project because I was trying to reconnect to nature. I was trying to restore this small patch of unused land under a railroad trestle. And then it turned out that my community came out to help, and we got to know each other. And then we started improving our local schools, and we started doing this and we started doing that. So there's something about these reconnections that cause other reconnections to happen, even though we don't know how that works yet. And places like Wolf Ridge have a really important role in all three types of those connections. And so let me talk a little bit about at least what I saw when I was at Wolf Ridge in terms of those three kinds of connections. So let me start with connecting to nature. this is, I think, at least for me, it's what I think of right away when I think about what Wolf Ridge does. We take kids and teachers and parent chaperones who might not get a chance to get out into nature and bring people out there. And we teach them about what it is that they're seeing. Maybe that's about phenology. Maybe that's about stars. Maybe that's about water or plants or other species or animals that live in the region. And so that is serving two purposes. It's learning important facts about the world around us, and it's connecting people to nature as we're learning those important facts. Let me talk about connecting people to people. I think this is a magical thing that Wolf Ridge is able to do. And I collected some pictures from off of the web of different students and schools who've come to visit Wolf Ridge over the years. There are all different kinds of schools and students of many different ages coming to visit. And it's a really special experience, not only to get out into nature, but to be together doing that and learning how to communicate with one another, how to talk, how to listen, how to work together, and how to have an impact on each other. And I think I was at some point recently telling Joe and Smud this story about coming back to Wolf Ridge to visit. I don't know how many years after I was there, maybe 6 or 7 years after I had been there as a student naturalist, maybe a little bit longer, and driving up the North Shore, and I stopped to put gas in my car, and the kid at the checkout looked at me, tilted his head the other way and said, "Are you Lane?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm Lane." And he said, "Oh my goodness, you were my student naturalist when I was at Wolf Ridge. I loved being there. Let me tell you about," and I got a 15-minute spiel of all the things that this kid had learned half of his lifetime ago when he had come to visit Wolf Ridge. So a really special place in terms of connecting people to one another. And then finally, connecting people to themselves. I think we all learn something about ourselves when we push ourselves to do more and to do better. And to have a place where we can do that and have fun is really a precious thing. Okay, so 3 things people want to do. They want to connect to each other. They want to connect to nature, and they want to connect to themselves. And a special place that we have in Wolf Ridge, and that it's helping students to do all of those things. So besides connections, what else are we learning from our project that people want in a better future? And I wanted to talk just about a couple of topics that come up repeatedly as really important. And I've picked these ones out in particular because they're, again, things that Wolf Ridge has chosen to focus in on. Many of those have been chosen even really since I was there, or have become a greater focus since I was there, which is really, really fun to see. And those are things like clean water and better sourcing of food. So the sort of better ways of providing for ourselves. So food and water are 2 critical ecosystem services or benefits that we get from nature. And they just come up over and over again as being important things that people want to see in a better future. They want to see us able to get the food and the water that we need without destroying other things. And then another thing that comes up over and over again that I think is really important is people are looking for ideas and inspirations of ways to live a little bit lighter on the land. And that's a place that I think things like the Living Building Challenge, the certified net zero energy and net zero water building that are not only sort of sitting at the cutting edge of what it's possible to do, but doing that in a way that is exposing thousands of people to how you do that, to the fact that it's possible, to the ability to come and see it and learn about it and ask questions about it and think, could I do that? Okay, so let me talk a little bit about stories. I won't talk very much longer. So in the world of science, we use storytelling in a really particular way. And what we do is we talk about scenarios. And scenarios are really just stories. They have a sort of logical plot and a narrative that govern the manner in which things unfold. And what we're doing with our project is we're starting with these seeds over here on the left, and we figure out how to grow them into different kinds of futures. So we say, well, if these are the seeds you're interested in, maybe it's living building challenge, and it's clean water, and it is better gender relations, or better approaches to diversity and racism. And then we can walk those stories into the future and think about the pathways that we need to take to get to those futures. And it turns out that that's really important for helping us to build resilience. So when things aren't going well, or things are changing suddenly, we need the ability to deal with that change, to adapt, to do something different. We need to be ready to make those kinds of changes. And it turns out that thinking through what the future might bring and different kinds of alternatives and different ways that we can cope with those alternatives helps us to build that kind of resilience. It helps us to be faster on our feet. I think of it sometimes like it's like playing a sport, and you're standing up on your toes instead of standing back on your heels. And what the storytelling does is get us up on those toes so that we're ready to act. And that's really important right now, as we see that we're going through a massive global pandemic that is changing a lot of things. And we're finding in all sorts of ways that we need to be ready to act quickly to adapt to that future. And so Smud asked me to talk at least a little bit about the COVID pause and what kinds of impacts we see that that's having. So I'll do that just briefly. And scientifically, I think what we see is some things actually reacted very quickly to the COVID pause. So this is, I lied, this is another graph. I forgot this one was coming. So this is another graph. And this is showing the No2 emissions in China in January. So before we had the shutdown there. And then in February after they shut down. And you can see this dramatic decline in NO2 in the atmosphere, which is a critical pollutant. So some things like this that change really quickly, like air pollution, did change really quickly. Now, I don't have a graph of what this looks like today, but it's unfortunately a lot more like this graph on the left. When things opened up, we kind of went right back to where we were. On the flip side, things that change slowly, like greenhouse gas emissions, changed a little bit because we traveled less, there were fewer airplanes, but they didn't change that much. So we get quick changes that change back to where they were quickly, and slower changes that hopefully will be slower to return also. There are just a couple of thoughts about that. So let me come back a little bit to the importance of stories and scenarios and thinking about the future, and to the importance, in my mind anyway, of places that help us to see what that better future might look like, places that inspire us with all that they're able to do, places like Wolf Ridge. This is one of my favorite quotes that I ran into up here in Montreal by a famous French writer. You might know him as the author of Le Petit Prince, or The Little Prince. This is from a different book. And what he says is, if you want to build a ship, don't start with collecting wood, cutting the planks, and assigning work, but awaken people a longing for the wide and open sea. And so I just want to end by pointing out all that Wolf Ridge and places like Wolf Ridge are doing to do this, to bring kids into nature, to provide inspiration by seeing how beautiful that nature is, to provide ways to connect with it, to connect with each other, and to see, well, how to cut planks and why that might be important if we are, in fact, longing for the wide and open sea.
Thank you. Thank you to Lane. Thank you for all that have joined us this evening. I know that the vast number of you on this Zoom event tonight are already donors and supporting Wolf Ridge. And for those that are not, please consider helping us. It's going to be nearly a year of no students on site. Our losses are going to be at about $2.5 million worth of revenue. Please consider giving tonight. And if you are already somebody who's recently given, please consider in opening the network for us. Reach out to your friends or colleagues that really value the type of work we do and work that produces people like Lane Bennett.